All right, now let's talk about typography, which is all about fonts and their sizes. So first, we're going to look at the mobile version of our design because we're going to take the mobile first approach. Then we'll readjust our styles for wider screens. So here in Photoshop, we're going to activate the Type tool by pressing T. Then we click on this heading to find its font. It's right here, Enter. Now, this is the same font used everywhere else on this page, except in one case. Here in the testimonial section, we have a different font for the name of the person. So look, it's this font, Montserrat, or however you want to say it. This is the only place where we have used this font. So here I want to consolidate the fonts and drop this font because, as I told you before, every time we import a new font, we're increasing the cost of downloading our page. So I want to minimize the number of fonts that have to be downloaded. Now, to get these fonts, we're going to go to fonts.google.com, and here we search for Enter. It's right here. All right. What styles do we need? Well, back to our design mockup. For this element, which is an H2 element, we're using Inter Extra Bold. For the body text, we're using Inter Regular. For this other heading, we're using Inter Bold. And further down in the dark section, for this heading, we're using Inter Semi-Bold. So we have quite a few variations of this font. Now, sometimes these are done accidentally by a designer, but other times they're deliberate. Now, in this case, I want to do some consolidation because I don't think all these variations really make a big difference to the end user. So I want to limit the number of styles for our font because every new style that we add will result in a separate font file to be downloaded. So back to Google Web Fonts. Here's the regular style. I'm going to select this. Now let's close this panel. Then further down, we have the bold style. Let's select this as well. Good. Now on the top, we can view our selected styles. So Enter in regular and bold. Great. Now we need to copy these two link elements and add them to our HTML markup. So back to our HTML markup, I'm going to paste these before the other link elements. Good. So next, we go to our style sheet and define a rule for our body element. So body, I'm going to set the font family here. So all elements will automatically inherit it. Font family is Inter. Now I want to include some fallback fonts in the same style. This is a sans serif font, so I'm going to include Arial, Helvetica, and sans serif. Good. Now to make sure that everything is working up to this point, we go to index.html and add a few elements. Now let me show you a cool trick. I want to render an H1, an H2, and an H3. So we type H, then we add a $sign. This will be replaced by numbers like 1, 2, 3, and so on. Now inside the heading tags, we want to have label like heading 1, heading 2, and heading 3. So here in braces, we type heading, space, and a $sign. Again, the $sign will be replaced by 1, 2, 3. At the end, we multiply this by 3 and then press tab. We quickly created this structure. Now let's add a paragraph with some dummy text. Let's say 20 words. Good. We're using the right font, but the colors are not right. So back to our style sheet. For our body element, I'm going to set the color to color body. This is the right color. Great. Now for our headings, we're going to use a different color. So over here, we're going to define a rule for our headings, H1, H2, and H3. Here we set the color to color headings. Good. So that's exactly what we wanted. Now we need to set the font sizes. So back to the mobile version of our design. Here's our H1 element. The size of this element is 70 pixels. So back to our style sheet. Here we want to define a rule for our H1 element and set the font size to, but we don't want to use 70 pixels here because, as I told you before, pixels are absolute units. They're not flexible. So if the user changes the default font size in their browser, our web page is not going to reflect that change. So here we want to use the rem unit. Now, if we set this to 1 rem, that means 1 times the font size of the HTML element. Now, currently we haven't set the font size for the HTML element. So by default, it's going to be 16 pixels. This is set by the browser. Now, earlier I showed you a trick. So if we set the font size of the HTML element to 62.5%, that means 62.5% of 16 pixels, which is what? 10 pixels. So let's set this to 62.5%. Now, when we set the font size of the H1 element to 1 rem, that means 10 pixels. So this makes calculations easier. Now back to our design mockup, the font size of the H1 element is 70 pixels. That is equivalent to 7 rems. Similarly, the font size of our H2 elements is 40 pixels. So that is equivalent to 4 rems. So back to our style sheet. Here I'm going to set the font size to 7 rems. For H2, I'm going to set the font size to 4 rems. And for H3, I'm going to set the font size to 3 rems. Now, what about H4, H5, and H6? Well, we don't have them on this page. So for now, I don't want to worry about them. We can always come back and add them if you really need them. Now, we should also set the font size for our body text. So up here in the body element, we set the font size to, on mobile, our body text is 24 pixels. So that is equivalent to 2.4 rems. So 2.4 rems. Good. Here's what we get. Looks great. Now these lines are a little bit too close. So back to our rule, I'm going to set the line height to 1.5. And as you know, this means 1.5 times the current font size. All right, now we have some space here and it's easier to read this paragraph. Great. Now the last thing we want to adjust is the margin below each of these headings. So currently there is so much space between this heading and this paragraph. So back to our design mockup, we need to measure the distance between this heading and the paragraph. So let's select the ruler, draw a line. This is an approximate value. So over here, look at the height. That is 20 pixels. So equivalent to what? 2 rems. So for H3 element, I'm going to set margin bottom to 2 rems. Here's what we get. We still have so much space between the heading and the paragraph. So let's inspect the heading using Chrome DevTools. All right. Now, here in the Styles tab, down below, look at the margin below the heading. It's 20 pixels or 2 rems. Now I'm going to select the paragraph element, and I want you to look at the top margin. It's 24 pixels. So here we have margin collapsing. So the margin below the heading and the margin above the paragraph are collapsed into 24 pixels. So even though we set this property here, it's not really making a difference because the margin above the paragraph is greater than this value. So to solve this problem, we can define a rule for our paragraphs and set the top margin to 0. This way, we let the headings decide the margin above the paragraph, okay? So here's what we get. It's better than before, but still, we have so much space here. Compare this with our design mockup. So what is happening? So back to this page, I'm going to select this H3 element. Now look at the space below the character G. We have some space here. Do you see that? So the font that we're using here already includes some space above and below each character. So to make our page as close as possible to our design, we have to use a smaller value for bottom margin. Let's say 1 rem. Here's what we get. I think this is very close to our design mockup. Great. Now, before recording this lesson, I did some experimentation and realized we should use the same bottom margin for H1 and H2 elements. Now, we don't want to duplicate this property here and in our H1 element. It doesn't make sense. So I'm going to take this from here and apply it in this row. This way, we have a single place for setting the bottom margin. So we're done with the mobile version. Now let's look at the standard version for laptops and desktop computers. So real quick, look at the size of this heading. That's 80 pixels. So now I want you to pause the video and find the size of H2, H3, and body text. Now back to our style sheet, we're going to write a media query for screens that are larger than 1024 pixels. This is kind of a standard breakpoint that a lot of frameworks like Bootstrap and Tailwind use. So media screen and min width 1024 pixels. For our body element, we're going to set the font size to 1.8 rems. For H1, we're going to set the font size to 8 rems. For H2, we're going to set the font size to 4 rems. And for H3, we're going to set the font size to 2.4 rems. So here's what we get for mobile. Now, let's resize the browser and see what we get for laptops and desktops. Do you see the difference? Beautiful. So we're done here. Now the last step. We go to the source control panel, we review our changes, and then make a commit. We want to take a snapshot of our project at this point in time. So here for the message, we say, define the styles for the fonts. So this message properly identifies what this commit or what this snapshot is all about. Now, let's go ahead and make the commit. Beautiful. So we're done with typography. Next, we're going to implement our first component.